How Black the Sky by T.J. Marquis. Axeborn insisted that Gorgonbane follow the city garrison's routine, including training drills, sleeping in the barracks, eating in the mess, and maintaining their uniforms. It was the most organised Pierce had been in a long time. Axeborn himself met, slept, and ate as the garrison's officers did. He said this would help the soldiers of the city to see Gorgonbane as comrades rather than interlopers. It was after being dismissed for his unit's R&R that Pierce found the time to visit the centre of town, and the Everlasting Temple itself. The temple complex was like a city within the city, and seemed to have its own peculiar traffic flow, schedule, and rules of decorum. In general, it was a quiet place, for most people there were either worshipping or studying. Pierce wandered through the halls of the place, got lost in it, passed by holy mages, reverent pilgrims, groundskeepers, and curious tourists like himself. He paused in each lengthy gallery, their glass ceilings refracting the red sun's light, to study the paintings displayed on the walls. Most were of great battles and mighty feats, their subjects so ancient that hardly a reliable source was left to separate fact from myth. Old kings were depicted in some of these, chiselled, regal men with ornate weapons who led their men into battle without fear. More than a few were of warrior queens, some of them armoured and armed like Scythia, but most were clothed in rich red robes, dealing out death with gem-encrusted spell staves. It had never really bothered him, and it still didn't now, but Pierce did briefly reflect on the constant state of war these old images implied. How long had the rulers of the nations of Overland been fighting amongst themselves for the continent's dwindling resources and real estate? How many times had the minions and abominable creatures of the Underlands tried to conquer the surface realm? Had there ever been a lull in the fighting as long as this past decade? Was all of this conflict here just so men and women could learn to walk the glorious path? That's what the sages said. Pierce had heard of a sculpture he wished to see, placed deep in the labyrinth of the temple, in its own tall gallery. He asked a holy mage about it and was politely given directions. When he finally came to the gallery holding the sculpture, Pierce couldn't have said where exactly he was in the temple complex, but he guessed it was somewhere near the centre. He knew that the great sanctuary wasn't more than a few twists and turns away. The sculpture was a statue of human form, perhaps 60 feet tall, and the red sun looked down on it through the glass ceiling above. The form was a bearded man, with cord thews beneath taut, fatless skin. His teeth were gritted in exertion as he raised a mighty hammer above his head, in preparation for a strike. One side of the hammer's head was shaped like the front of a human skull, and the other dripped with blood. The giant man was down on one knee, his right thigh resting against the side of a weathered anvil. The sculpture defied perspective, bending this portion of the image downward to show viewers below what lay on the anvil. It was a smaller human, half male, half female, with a distinct split down the middle, and different clothing on each half. The woman's hair had spilled onto the man's breast, and the man's only hand reached across their shared body to hold the woman's belly. They both had gritted teeth. Their legs were elongated into a tapered shape like the blade of a long sword, and the woman's arm was stretched out to one side in a partial crossguard. Pierce could almost hear the blows of the hammer, swinging down to shape the blade into its forger's vision. The sword people screamed or grunted with each impact, and the maker's sweat dripped from his brow and onto the steaming hot anvil. This was the blacksmith, he who forged from naught, master of the weapons that would one day slay oblivion itself. How far along that path am I? Pierce wondered to himself. Was his own blade fully shaped, fully sharpened? Had he been tempered? Would he be deemed fit to serve in the transcendent wars to follow this time of shaping and testing? He wondered too if the process was really as taxing for the blacksmith as it was depicted here. If he was almighty, it shouldn't be. Should it? Pierce let his eyes feast on the masterful artistry of the work, its lines, whether deep or subtle, and the little creases in the skin, hinted at by careful scrapes and gouges. That look in the blacksmith's eyes, like what he did was right and necessary. When his soul had its fill, Pierce left the gallery. Nothing went according to plan. Thinking back on it later, Pierce was continually tempted to blame himself. Really, he knew it couldn't be his fault, that he wasn't cursed with bad luck, that it couldn't spill over onto the people around him. Yet it didn't feel that way. It felt like he'd crashed into this city with the seeds of his own brand of chaos and sown them all around. At least the attack had been punctual. 10 days and no more. The sun was bright and hot that morning, crawling across the black sky with its slowly writhing tendrils. The night mist had been heavy, leaving the city structures covered with a sheen like sweat. Grondel's defenders were stationed on and behind its walls, with higher concentrations of troops at the gates. The ramparts were packed with the bodies of men and women. Most of the soldiers on the wall were armed with longbows, and not a few were mages of various kinds, with arrows and literal fire raining down upon them from up above. Cash's forces would not have an easy approach. Gorgonbane positioned themselves at the east gate, the largest of the four. S had deposited Agrathor high upon a minaret, where he would have good vantage on the battle and be able to call his lightning down on distant foes. Scythia had joined the honor guard that would protect the officers specifically, and she and Axborn were already mounted and ready for action. Pierce had insisted on being atop the ramparts with the common soldiers, and he waited impatiently there with the rest of the troops. The attack began with a rumbling in the ground, and Pierce's heart sunk as his intuition proved right once again. Muffled cracks sounded from unknown points of origin, and the buildings of the city groaned in protest. The cracking sounds grew in volume and frequency, soon punctuated by pops and the snapping of wooden beams. The people of Grondel looked all around, realizing that the sounds of structural failure were coming from everywhere at once. "Get down off the wall!" Pierce heard himself yelling, even as he ran. The men and women nearby did not hesitate to obey and began evacuating the ramparts, quickly joined by others. A signal sounded from down below. Axborn had just ordered the retreat Pierce had already started. Likely Scythia had sensed it coming. The city wall's golden enchantment flared in activation as the stresses from the ground beneath it began to push at wood frames and stone blocks. The portion of the ramparts Pierce had been stationed on bent and swelled upward, blocks losing contact with each other, sliding up or out. Those left on the ramparts lost their footing. Some slipped and fell. The base of the wall was lifted off the ground, sand and rocks falling away from the partially buried stone. Bodies fell in the midst of the wreckage. Screams cut short as they impacted the ground. A pillar of blackness appeared among the dust and rocks. Its tip pushed up at the wall. A second pillar, and another appeared. 5 of them, then 10. Pierce dared to come closer and take a look. The pillars were not of stone, but of flesh. Scarred black masses that brought to mind. No. In his shock, he couldn't accept it, and he began to back away. It was the same rough, oily skin as a monstrosity. These were fingers, but each was the size of a temple's column. Something gigantic was burrowing up from below. It was far more dramatic and oddly more simple than what Pierce had initially imagined. "Monstrosity!" someone cried, and the defenders were thrown into a panic, rushing away and into the streets between buildings that were still shuddering and cracking. Pierce forced himself into focus and took stock of the situation, scanning the city wall as it curved toward the east gate and beyond. There were more black hands, impossibly huge, pushing up at the wall, tossing whole sections of it aside and sweeping away any remaining rubble. There was a wrist, a forearm, an elbow. The arm bent, muscles straining as the subterranean creature began to pull itself out of the hole it must have dug. Or maybe they were one with the earth in some strange way. Loose portions of the ground, near where the wall had been slid into the void the monstrosity was evacuating. People were screaming as more of the mega-giants began to emerge, forming a wall of horrid flesh where once there had been one of blessed stone. Pierce turned again and dashed toward the first hand he'd seen, drawing his sword in a flash of blue. The giant was now visible up to the elbows, seeking purchase on open ground. Pierce let loose his battle cry and swiped viciously at the hard black flesh. His bone melter blazed and cut easily into the huge appendage, severing muscle and tendon. The slightest contact beginning to melt bone so that it flowed out of the gash, along with the thing's black blood. He hadn't severed the arm clear through, so he struck again and again, skirting around its circumference, and the arm crashed to the ground like a felled tree, but twitched as the last bits of its weird life ran their course. Stone from the uprooted wall fell from the dead hand's fingers, smashing into the ground like hammers as Pierce dodged out of the way. He found himself thinking back to the sculpture of the blacksmith in the depths of the everlasting temple, that hammer falling again and again. These monstrosities were far bigger. The giant's other arm swung toward him blindly. It was too long. He wouldn't be able to dodge. He braced himself to be crushed. The massive forearm flinched, fingers splaying an instant before the lightning was visible. It was like something exploded beneath the dark flesh, so fiercely as to split the arm in two. Pierce heard a distant echo of Agrathor's voice, screaming something unintelligible. More lightning followed, cracking and ripping down from above, thrumming up from the ground below. Pierce danced away from the growing wall of mega monstrosities to form up with the rest of the defenders. Another horn signal sounded. It seemed too soon in a battle for this, but looking down the line of the ruined wall, Pierce had to agree it was the right call. The defenders began to retreat toward the city centre. The temple had to be defended. Agrathor looked down on the destruction from his perch upon the minaret. The dozens of monstrosities, bigger than any he'd ever seen, reared up out of the ground all along the city wall. As he tried to understand the situation, he continued to call lightning down on their heads, their reaching limbs. The mega monstrosities did not chase the garrison troops in retreat, but continued to sweep their arms about, razing buildings to the ground, catching hold of anyone close to them and breaking their tiny bodies with impossibly strong hands. Some were eaten. The giants were every bit as nasty as their smaller counterparts, with hard-to-resolve features scarred as with fire, sparse hair and scraggly beards still wet with muck from the Underlands. Their deep-set eyes were clouded beyond recognition of colour. They formed an oppressive wall, clearly to keep the Grundalites within the city's confines. It was a cruel joke, supplanting the ramparts and inverting their function. If they weren't here to attack, what were they going to do? Some of the mega monstrosities seemed to realise who was responsible for the rending bolts of lightning and began to throw huge blocks of stone at Agrathor's perch. Agrathor did not panic, managing to blow a few blocks into pieces with lightning from his spear. Ultimately, he knew the minaret would not withstand this assault, and he vaulted down to the ground dozens of feet below, relishing the shudder the impact sent reverberating through his bones. The top few floors of the tower came crashing down behind him, wrecked by a volley of stone from the giants. The garrison soldiers were in retreat, and Agrathor caught sight of the kid. "Pierce!" he yelled. The kid caught sight of him and they fell into step. "Go back and take out a few of those scumsuckers!" Pierce shook his head, continuing to jog up the street. "I want to. Believe me, Agrathor, but you can tell they're up to something. This isn't the whole of it."
"I can see that!"
Agrathor snapped, but he didn't argue. Up ahead, Grondalites were fleeing from something, pushing against the flow of the retreat. Behind them, a row of apartments lifted off the ground and fell apart. Wreckage spilling into the street. Dozens of people were crushed. The sounds of terror silenced. In place of the apartment building was a twisted obelisk, rising from the ground. Something like heat waves shimmered across its spiral-ridged surface. "Better wreck it," Pierce thought. "That seems like a good thing to stop," he called over to Agrathor, who nodded and gritted his teeth. They rushed forward together, barreling through slower people toward their goal. The minor injuries of bystanders were insignificant before the unknown purpose of this ebony monolith. Other buildings were falling, being supplanted, and obelisks rose all around. Pierce saw S hovering above the crowd, arms outstretched. Her floating liquid orbs glowed like magma, and they shot back and forth through an obelisk's mass in wild patterns, punching holes until it lost integrity and began to crumble. "Let's do what she did," Pierce called out. "I'll take the far side."
"Yeah,"
said Agrathor. Pierce didn't know what he meant by that, but the skeleton man dashed toward the obelisk, brandishing his sparking spear. Agrathor plunged his weapon into the base of the obelisk with a crunch that sent a fissure running up its brittle surface. Pierce let his sword bite into the black stone, drawing it around the obelisk's circumference to create a deep incision. On the far side of the thing, he stopped and began hacking at the stone like a woodsman felling a tree. Agrathor roared, channeling electricity through his spear and into the core of the obelisk. The brittle stone couldn't handle the heat and pressure. Cracks radiated out to the obelisk's surface, and a section of it blew out in hot, ragged chunks that pummeled Pierce's armor. The obelisk began to topple, and Pierce and Agrathor screamed for people to flee. It came to the ground with a resounding boom, crushing the remains of the building it had supplanted before splintering into countless shards. Pierce and Agrathor dashed madly for the next obelisk. Above and beyond them, S2 had chosen a second target. Small gangs of the city's mages had formed up and hurled fire, lightning, and shockwaves at the wicked-looking obelisks, taking down their fair share. But like the mega monstrosities at the outer wall, the obelisks cropped up all across the city, too fast to keep up with. The ones that reached their full height began to hum. It was a low-pitched drone that resonated in the buildings all around. Pierce could feel it in his gut. It buzzed in his skull. He could only imagine how Agrathor must feel with no meat to dull the vibrations.
"We can't keep up with them!"
Agrathor shouted to him in frustration as they toppled a second obelisk and fled before its collapse.
"Even S can't be everywhere at once!"
Pierce huffed, too busy to agree, but Agrathor was right. How long had it even been since the attack began, and the city was already in a shambles, its garrison routed? They needed a dozen S's, 24 Agrathors to even have a chance at survival.
"Might as well join up with the others!"
Agrathor hollered. Pierce raised a hand and made a forward chopping motion, as he'd seen Scythia and Axborn do before.
That means fire at will,
Agrathor said. A laugh crouched in his voice. Sorry, Pierce puffed. Thought it meant go ahead.
We'll get you sorted out after this, kid,
Agrathor said, seemingly unwinded.
Probably should have taught you the signals before we got here anyway,
he mused. S caught sight of them as she cruised overhead and began to fly parallel to them, her fiery orbs destroying every obelisk they passed. It wasn't enough. The more there were, the more horrible the drone was. People were falling to their knees in the streets, voiding their stomachs and retching helplessly. Some were crushed by falling debris. We need to get to Scythia, S cried down to them. She looked at Agrathor. She seemed to expect him to know why. He shook his helmeted skull. The Amulet of Silence, she yelled. Agrathor's flaming eyes brightened with remembrance. What does it do? Pierce asked between breaths.
Seriously, kid?
Agrathor retorted. Pierce would have shrugged, but his body was busy running.
She uses it for infiltration, cancels out all sound in the area. S can amplify the field, keep us all safe.
Can you do the whole city? Pierce called up to her. She looked chagrined. I cannot, she said heavily. But we at least can survive to give aid, if any aid will suffice. There's got to be a way, Pierce said. Can you at least fold us to the temple? Again she said no.
It's a one-man ride, kid,
said Agrathor. They raced on. When at last they reached the concentric rings at the city centre, the place was awash with disaster. Shops and shrines that had just been bustling with healthy activity that morning had been supplanted by the emergence of the obelisks. The low hum was acute and pervading all at once. Cracks were spreading across every stone surface in sight. Pierce continued to wonder what the aim was here. Why conquer a heap of rubble? The city's defenders had fallen into formation on the temple grounds, and everyone waited nervously for the next phase of attack. As yet, they had seen nothing that had been expected. No infantry, no Dogran cavalry, no siege equipment. Whatever power Cash had stumbled upon, it was unprecedented. S, Agrathor and Pierce were allowed through the ranks of men and women warriors, and soon they joined Axborn and Scythia, and the officers now under the red-bearded man's command. If this sound gets any more intense, Axborn was saying to Scythia, you'll have to activate it, and we won't be able to talk. Scythia nodded. We'll have to rely on signals during whatever comes next. Can you protect the men? One of the officers asked. What's the range? Scythia looked to S and said, I can do about 5 yards. S mulled this over. As much as 50 yards, she said, but shook her head slightly. But it will fluctuate according to distractions and my adrenaline. Do not trust the perimeter as a sure thing. It's better than nothing, the officer said. All right, said Axborn. Everyone clear on the plan? Yes, said Scythia. There isn't one. Her husband smirked. It was true, though. How could they plan for whatever was coming next if it was as unusual as all of this? A drumming sound boomed from the city all around them. Disparate pounding impacts that shook the ground and air alike. The deep percussive strikes gradually came synchronized in a steady, simple beat. Agrathor's eyes dimmed as if he were calmed by it, but everyone else looked uneasy. Do it, Agrathor said. Scythia reached into her tunic at the bosom and pulled out the Amulet of Silence. It was a narrow white gem filled with a misty light, cradled in a silver setting that dangled from her strong neck on a silver chain. S came near to her, but took no visible action. Scythia did nothing more than to grasp the gem, and the world went silent around her. Pierce felt like he'd gone deaf. There was no sound to be heard. The air was still, though the ground continued to reverberate with the shock of collapsing buildings and the drumming of distant titans. It was an uncomfortable feeling, yet everyone around Pierce looked like some of their unease had been relieved. Though it hadn't been long since the appearance of the obelisks, their sickening drone had been so encompassing as to feel like a natural part of existence. They had always droned, cracking stone and voiding people's guts, and they always would. No sooner had everyone settled into the relief of silence than the temple grounds themselves shifted from merely rumbling to a violent shaking. It was like something 100 times larger than even the mega monstrosities had the earth under the temple in its hand, and was jostling it back and forth like a toddler with a new toy, a true titan. Parts of the temple complex began to collapse. Glass burst upward from galleries and the stained windows of domes and minarets. Walls fell outward or inward. Fissures opened up in the ground. No one called the second retreat, nor did anyone signal it. The garrison troops, officers, and Gorgonbane simply fled in the eerie silence, trying to get clear of the temple grounds. Rarely had Pierce felt this frustrated. Give him a clear enemy, or even 100 foes, and let them be slain at the edge of his sword. This was, well, it was unfair, dishonourable, crooked. It was exactly what one should expect of the Underlord and his minions. Why would they show themselves and fight when such utter destruction could be achieved with such apparent ease? How did the blacksmith expect this to temper his creations? His children. It was not another obelisk that emerged from the ruination of the everlasting temple. It was the wide domes and towers of a citadel of dark green stone. Its tightly fitted blocks dripped with the Underlands' pervading muck. They did not seem stressed in the slightest in pushing aside the still collapsing walls and walkways of the temple. The whole place was lit by a ghostly grey aura. Testadel, Haxborn breathed. How? Pierce had the odd thought that seeing the place again was like returning to a friend's house. Now he knew where things were inside of it, and something of how the place worked. He'd even lived there for a short time, albeit in the dungeons. Is Forgemaster 77 in there somewhere? People who had taken refuge inside the temple were caught up in the rising structure's ramparts and spires, trying in vain to get a grip on anything that might keep them from falling to their deaths. They must be screaming, but Pierce couldn't hear them. He saw that mighty sculpture of the blacksmith, carried up off the ground in the space between two greenish domes. The blacksmith's look of pain and toil seemed appropriate. Still, the defenders were helpless. This was not something any of them could fight. They would have done better to evacuate the city rather than to become trapped behind its ruined walls. But no one could have known. Pierce had only guessed. He wondered how this was even possible, but there it was, happening right in front of him. A harsh blow of the blacksmith's hammer. Testadel ceased rising and its gates swung open. They were the very gates through which Pierce had escaped not too long ago. Then came a phase of the attack more like what he had expected, only from the wrong side of the walls. Monstrosities emerged first, mouths open in silent roars, fists swinging at walls, archways, and people who hadn't been killed in the temple's collapse. Behind them came werewolves, the hunting hounds of Cash's forces. They loped along in ragged lines, held in formation only by some brutal mode of training that had been ingrained in them. Their slavering mouths hung open in gleeful canine smiles, and their eyes shone a sickly yellow, even at this distance. They held to their lines and began to fan out. Next were the Gen, natives of the Underlands. They were bipedal, armoured and of medium stature, very like the humans, but grey-skinned and with longer limbs. Only the males were known to march into battle. Behind the ranks of Gen waited the Pain Reapers in all their horrific variations, but these would likely not fight. They came only to live up to their names, a thing they would see to when the battle was over. The ranks of defenders braced themselves, but surely each person knew they could not withstand this invasion. This did not deter the members of Gorgonbane. Axpawn gave the signal, and the fearsome band of 5 rode out from among the garrison troops. Unfortunately, this left several squads without the benefit of Scythia's enchantment of silence. Soldiers began to succumb to the sound-induced nausea. Pierce knew he had to be extra vigilant. There would be no sounds signalling the approach and attack of the enemy. Everything would rely on staying in formation, covering each other's backs. He couldn't help but wonder what they hoped to do against all the might of the invasion. Axpawn signalled again. The cone of silence was about to shrink for a few moments as S shifted her amplification powers to Agrathor. They would have to keep the formation tight. S held up a hand and counted down from 5 on her fingers. There was no discernible difference for Pierce when the enchanted area shrank, but even more common soldiers were left without oral protection. Agrathor lifted his spear high, reflexively calling out a challenge or invocation that no one would hear. A pair of lightning bolts ripped through a monstrosity's shoulders, bursting blood vessels and severing its arms. The thing's face contorted in pain and it screamed silently, toppling to the ground to crush a pair of Genian squads. This instantly garnered the attention of the other dozen or so monstrosities, and they began to converge on Gorgonbane. This had been expected. Gorgonbane rushed toward the approaching giants, letting them get close. Each member had to take out at least 2 monstrosities, and their time was limited. S signalled that she had resumed amplifying Scythia's amulet, and the group broke formation. Axpawn and S dashed for the leftmost giants. Scythia took the centre, and Agrathor and Pierce flanked right. The monstrosities had proven not to be entirely moronic, but they seemed to spare little thought for tactics, and they were content to focus their malice on whatever was in front of them. This made it easier for Pierce and his comrades to mount their attack. He desperately wanted to see the others in action, but this was not the time. He had to focus on his own task. He meant to take down 3 of the giants. At least these weren't the mega variety. He dropped down off Gash, sending the beast away. Then he plotted his course in his mind, connecting the dots, brainstorming solutions for when things inevitably went wrong. The first monstrosity came into range and swiped at Pierce. With this smaller variety, dodging was plausible, but they were also faster, so he had to be precise with his movements. He laughed to think of a monstrosity as small. He vaulted over the thing's long arm, his sword flashing as he spun in the air. He only grazed the giant's arm, but the pain was enough for it to flinch. Pierce completed his spin, landing firmly on his feet, and made for the giant's ankles. It tried to stomp on him, but Pierce easily jumped out of the shadow of its foot. With a vicious swing, he drew his blade clean through the giant's lower leg, spilling blood and molten bone. The leg stump slid off of its severed ankle and the giant slipped onto its knees, still trying to get a grasp on Pierce. He circled around to its back and leapt up. The wide ridges of its scarred flesh and the way the skin was stretched taut over bone made it easy to find foot and handholds to climb the thing. It tried to turn, but Pierce stuck its back with his blade to help him hold on. Every time the giant stopped to register pain, Pierce was able to gain ground climbing. He sensed something and turned. A second monstrosity was coming, and a third behind it. Pierce was getting his wish. He kept climbing, the thrashing giant, waiting for the right moment. The second one came closer. Pierce drew back his blue blade and plunged it into the giant, severing its spine. Immediately it buckled, unable to hold its own weight on hands and knees. Soon it would die. Pierce gauged the jump and fired a blast from his gauntlet. Orange fire trailed behind him as he careened toward the second monstrosity. It tried to smash him between its hands, but a second blast quickly shot Pierce up and forward. He crashed into the thing's collarbone and beheaded it with one fell swoop of the bone melter. The head fell, mouth open, and suddenly Pierce heard the clamour of battle. He must have drifted out of Scythia's range. He tried to focus on the screams and clashing metal so he wouldn't succumb to the unending drone of the obelisks. The headless monstrosity staggered forward, several long steps, before its body registered what had happened and its legs buckled swiftly. Pierce took another leap of faith before he lost too much altitude, firing his gauntlet to maintain height. After all that silence, the gauntlet blast was deafening. The third monstrosity caught him against all odds, immediately trying to squeeze the life out of him, but it foolishly brought him close to its chest, and Pierce fired his final gauntlet blast directly at its chest. Skin and ribs disappeared in an instant, bearing the brunt of the fiery assault, but there was heat and force enough to burn the giant's already black heart. Its blood boiled, the heart burst, and the hands released their death grip on Pierce. He had a moment of deja vu as he rode the dying giant's body to the ground. The horrible music of the obelisks pounded into Pierce's ears. It was getting stronger. He looked up. Werewolves were descending upon him. Scythia still loved watching Axborn at work, even after all these years. She'd crippled 2 monstrosities, he'd slain 1, and they were teaming up on a 4th together before they meant to end the first 2. There was 1 gem left in her right bracelet, blazing white as if begging to be used. It would give her 5 surges of speed before shattering. She activated it now and felt the familiar rush fill her veins. She knew the grin that reached her face looked mad, but it was involuntary, a natural reaction to the quickening of her muscles. She dismounted her bloodhoof and dashed toward the 4th monstrosity in a blur, laughing in glee at its attempts to smash or catch her. She leapt over its futile swipes like a dancer across a stage, eyes locking on her husband as he approached astride his Raptorian. They met at the thing's feet, and she flung the end of her massive spiked flail at one ankle, nearly driving the bone out the other side of its leg. The giant may have screamed, but all were still silent. Axborn cut the Achilles tendon on the other leg with a single chop of his halberd, mouth open in his war cry. His mount loped away as the monstrosity came to its knees. He swung the Raptorian back in, baiting the giant, and when it brought down a hand like a slab of stone to crush him, he caught the giant's palm on the tip of his weapon. Axborn vaulted off the Raptorian and planted his feet firmly on the ground, reversing force. The monstrosity tried to pull its hand away, but it was as if the man weighed many thousands of pounds, and his piercing halberd would not relinquish its hold. When the giant's other hand came flying in to swat him, Scythia closed the distance in a dash and leapt onto the limb, smashing the thumb with her flail. It lifted its arms reflexively. She rode the momentum and cruised up through the air. Was this how Pierce felt when he used the gauntlet to fly? Exhilarating. Lithely, she landed on the monstrosity's arm and dashed up it in an instant, leaping with the force of an additional dash toward the thing's eyes. It had been watching her progress but was far too slow to halt it. She produced a gem bomb from her belt, and with great strength and the force of her dashes, she plunged her hand into the monstrosity's eye, leaving the bomb behind. The giant leaned back with a wail of agony, giving Scythia its body as a ramp to dash back to the ground. Axborn retracted his halberd, and the giant's body convulsed as Scythia's bomb exploded in its skull, leaving little behind. The body crashed to the ground. Scythia dropped the enchantment of silence ever so briefly, whistling for Nova, and the Bloodhoof came shortly. She mounted up and regrouped with Axeborn. They shared a look of love and mutual respect. Down the battle lines, S had slain 3 monstrosities with typical ease. They hadn't fallen as simply to her liquid orbs as the obelisks had, but several dozen shots of each one straight through those giant bodies proved more than they could shake off. Agrathor had blasted 2 apart with multiple strikes of his lightning, and was just then using his spear to put one out of its misery. Pierce was fleeing a pack of 100 werewolves. "Pierce!" Scythia cried, but her voice made no sound. She pointed, and Axeborn turned, his loving eyes away from her and toward the kid. The monstrosities were large and strong, but slow, and few in number. A pack of werewolves would be a different fight altogether, and many of them would be wearing clothes or armor with enchantments. Anything could happen in a fight like that. They had to help him. Axeborn had seen something, was trying to draw her attention to it. She followed his gaze to the battle lines beyond the werewolves. The garrison troops had been cut off from them, overrun. There was no discernible order to the mob that she saw in the distance. Cash's Genborn banners flew deep into the defenders' lines. They were being routed. Scythia turned her eyes back toward Pierce and said a prayer to the blacksmith. They had to save the only one they could save. Growls, barks, snarling, and panting followed Pierce as he rushed to get back in range of Scythia's amulet. Some of the sounds may have been words, but he wasn't familiar with the dialect of werewolves. He couldn't help but steal glances at them. They were horrid things, yet enviable. Their bodies were lean and muscular in a casual way no humans could ever be. Men could work their bodies for hours on end, day after day, and never achieve such comfortable, confident strength and physique. Combined with their singular determination and focus on the hunt, any one of them would be a fearsome foe. Behind Pierce there were hundreds, and some of them were gaining on him. The gnashing of a werewolf's teeth cut off abruptly as Pierce re-entered the cone of silence. His ears popped. He glanced backward. The vast werewolf pack had halted as one, confusion by the sudden loss of one of their primary senses. Those in the lead lifted their snouts, sniffing. The whole pack roared mutely, and their chase resumed. At least Pierce had gained some distance, temporarily. He caught sight of the rest of Gorgonbane converging on him. Bless those people. Not one of them had failed to meet their monstrosity quota. Pierce could see the hulking, lifeless bodies behind them. One of them had its head blown off. Who'd done that? Axeborn waved frantically for Pierce's attention. He pointed at Pierce, then pointed upward. Fly? I can't fly, he thought. Blew out the gems. He came within about 10 yards of Axeborn, and the man had lifted one leg. He watched Pierce closely. He lifted a hand over his head and hesitated, then brought it down in a chopping motion as he stomped mightily on the ground. Pierce made a subconscious connection and leapt. He knew it must be an illusion, but he thought the ground beneath him rippled in a wave, travelling outward from Axeborn. The werewolves either didn't see the ripple or weren't concerned by it, but they didn't leap, and all their ranks were bowled over. Lupine bodies crashed into one another, fanged mouths yelped soundlessly. In their anger, some of them slashed at each other with their claws. Pierce fell in with his comrades. Axeborn squared off against the werewolves as they righted themselves and began to approach again, more cautiously this time. This was more the kind of battle Gorgonbane had been expecting today. Pierce swiftly scanned the city. He hadn't looked up in a while. Grondel was razed. The everlasting temple lay in ruins. There still seemed to be fighting going on where the garrison troops had been arrayed, but Pierce couldn't see Grondel's flag flying among them. Gorgonbane had failed. They fought now only to preserve their own lives. On the bright side, that opened up a few options. The tactic had been discussed before the battle, and now was the time to use it. So we've covered gate breach, wall breach, undermining. If we end up outnumbered, Scythia had said, what's the plan then?
If S could multiply my strikes rather than amplify,
Agrathor posited. S shook her head. That skill is a lending of power from me to you. I cannot alter the nature of your abilities. You can't just make more bolts, Pierce asked. Or do them faster.
Make more! Do it faster!
Agrathor mocked.
Why don't you just make that sword grow longer? Or have it melt brains instead of bone? We can test it on you.
Pierce laughed. Agrathor grinned. Pierce said, Okay then. The rest of us are only good for single targets. That leaves S. But you said you can't just blow up an entire army. I cannot, she affirmed. Even if my telekinesis were more advanced, that would be too many all at once. She closed her eyes, white, painted eyelids glimmering. There is something, but I doubt you will find it palatable. What is it? Everyone asked.
Something like a bomb. Like one of Scythia's, but ethereal and very costly.
If it saves our lives, it could be worth it, Axborn said.
It would require someone's body parts. Well, just one part, really.
Everyone flinched. Pierce touched his chest absently. Would he be able to hand over a finger or a toe or more to save his own life? And that of the group? He supposed in the moment he would do it with nary a second thought, but now, in premeditation, it seemed more than unpalatable. Involuntarily, his eyes drifted over to Agrathor. Everyone else was looking at him too. He noticed.
No,
He said, holding up skeletal hands and backing out of the group's huddle.
Just because I don't feel pain? No, that's not fair. These bones are all I've got left.
True, Agrathor. It is not fair, said Scythia. Our obvious thoughts do you a disservice. Do not think that we consider you merely a tool.
This seemed to pacify the man somewhat.
But, Scythia continued, in a life or death situation when all other hope is lost, it would be easiest,
and quickest, Axborn added,
if you did it,
Scythia finished. There was a long silence that even Pierce dare not break. He had only begun to imagine what it must be like to be Agrathor, to ask the skeleton man to part with another portion of himself.
Okay,
Agrathor had said, casting his green eyes downward.
I'll do it.
The werewolves were bearing down on them. It was time for something drastic. Pierce watched his comrades. Were they really going to do it? S took a deep breath. She tapped her chest under one arm. That was the signal. Agrathor looked dejected, but he nodded and approached her. He reached under his armor, and with a grimace, he snapped off one of his ribs. He gazed at it longingly, as if he was parting with an old friend. He even touched it to his teeth in what Pierce assumed was a skeleton's kiss. Then he handed it over to S and turned away. S ferreted the rib up one of her sleeves. She did something with it under her robe. She closed her eyes for a moment, and Pierce relished the doll-like quality of her face. He slapped himself, mentally. He might die in moments, fool. Focus! When she brought the rib back out, it glowed with a yellow fire that shifted and bent all around the bone. She kissed it, handed it to Axborn. He stared at it for a moment, heaved a sigh, drew back his hand and lobbed the bone out over the ranks of cautious werewolves. Every one of the vicious things turned its head up to follow the high arc of the rib bone. Many leapt up into the air as if they could catch it in their vile jaws. Some came close. One werewolf in the rear of the pack finally succeeded, and as its teeth closed around the bone, the power was released. There was no physical shockwave, but a shimmering cloud of yellow sparks bathed the huge portion of the battlefield in light and death. The werewolf's fur blackened and crumbled. As one, they lifted their snouts to the sky in a soundless howl. Their skin burned away in patches like paper over a fire. Their fat and muscles, ligaments and tendons, reduced into something black, like the pervading muck of the Underlands. All that remained was blood and bone, collapsing to the ground in perfect formation. The wave of death reached the ranks of Gen, who likewise melted, and the banners of Cash fell. From what Pierce could see, only a handful of the garrison troops had survived the rout. They had been lined up on their knees for execution and remained there, twitching in sobbing despair. Only the enemy, though, had been harmed by S's bone bomb. Not one of the invasion force had survived. The gates of Testadel had closed. The Pain Reapers may have retreated, or they may have died too. Pierce hadn't seen. The gates remained shut tight, and there was apparently not a capable force left in the ruins of Grondel to assault them. Everyone felt it through their feet when the deep drone of the obelisks stopped, and Scythia deactivated her amulet of silence. "Ah, finally," Pierce said.
Missed the sound of your own voice, huh?
Agrathor teased. Pierce smirked. It's just so lonely when everything's quiet. Indeed, all sound had returned to the space around Gorgonbane, and wails and sobbing echoed through the streets of what had been Grondel. When Pierce registered these sounds, he looked around and felt a heaviness settle on his heart. Nothing had gone according to plan. Not that anyone could have known what this day would hold. Cash had won the day, despite his heavy losses. Was he shut behind the black walls of Testadel, or had he hidden himself elsewhere? Where would he strike next?